Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we compare and contrast two views of the European project. In the second half of our show, we'll be joined by Daniel Hannan, Eurosceptic member of the European Parliament, representing Southeast England, and author of a new book titled Inventing Freedom, How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World. Up first, we're pleased to have international economist and energy expert Cornelia Meyer, Chairman and CEO of MRL Corporation, past Vice President of Government Relations at UBS, and former advisor to Japan's Foreign Trade Minister. Cornelia, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
And thanks for welcoming me to the Athenaeum here in London, here to discuss the European project with you. And I know you spend a lot of time working and thinking about this. Let's start with, how's the euro doing?
It's doing like the weather here. It's rather grisly, grim, dark. As you can see, the euro, obviously in terms of where the euro stands as a currency at this point, it's sort of close to reaching parity with the dollar. But that has a lot to do with the US ending the quantitative easing and Europe starting on a bigger scale, finally being allowed to start on a bigger scale quantitative easing. Where I sort of have a problem with the euro is it is a little bit nonsensical to have 15 countries and 15 monetary policies. If you want to have one currency, you need to get the fiscal and the monetary policies of the individual countries better aligned. You will not get from today having 15 to tomorrow having one, but there needs to be a clearly delineated process of how you can align that, because that is the levers that you have when you manage an economy, when you manage a currency. You need to have the same fiscal policies.
So is it fair to say that you can only make central planning work if you control everything?
Well, you can. This is not central planning, but if you have one currency, look, you went through that process in the United States, a few centuries ago,
right.
And you also, when you started to decide that you had one currency, the various states, you're still a federal country, but the various states started integrating their economic policies more closely.
So does that mean political union will be required to make the euro successful?
No, I don't think so. But what is required is better mechanisms of coordination. You will not get within the next two decades into political union. That will not happen. But when you look at why is the euro a useful thing to have for the European Union, it is very useful to have one currency, because if you have so many smaller countries, you become a more integrated economy. It becomes easier to trade. So in that sense, it does make sense. But you have to align the monetary policies and the fiscal policies more closely.
So how can the Germans and the Greeks align their fiscal policies?
Well, the Greeks could start with collecting some taxes. I think we would all be very happy if they started to do that.
Isn't that against their religion?
Well, sometimes you need to convert to a new religion, and this may be the time.
No, I mean, in all seriousness, you have a nation who grew up under occupation with the Ottomans, and so tax thievery and tax cheating is bred into the culture. It's very different than in Germany or Switzerland or Austria or some of the Northern European countries.
Yeah, but at the same time, you could argue that the country I hail from, which is Switzerland, I come from the canton that was the occupier of many of the other cantons. And all of these cantons by now also pay their taxes. Again, it will not happen from today to tomorrow. But governance is never a bad thing. And look at what the World Bank preaches to all the developing countries. You must collect your taxes, you must have governance. So governance is not a bad thing, and I would always err on the side of governance.
And how long do you think Germany is willing to wait before the Greeks start collecting taxes?
The Germans will need very good heart medicine. But the Germans do have a point. If you give somebody as much money as the Troika has given to Greece, then you expect certain behaviors. And I have a little bit of a problem, because when the IMF and the World Bank give a loan to a developing country, yes, we also agree that they should have certain structural adjustments. And I've used to work for the Asian Development Bank, so I was one of the people bringing these big structural adjustment loans to countries. And yes, we were very fierce in terms of, what they had to do in order to qualify for the release of the second tranche.
How many people actually believe that the Greeks will ever repay their outstanding sovereign debt?
I think most people hope against hope. But look, I think they will repay part of the outstanding debt. They may not repay everything, but when you look at what happened after the last Greek election, before the election, Mr. Tsipras and Mr. Varoufakis were very vociferous and said, well, we should have debt forgiveness. As soon as they got elected, they said, well, not really debt forgiveness. We want the tenor to get longer. So we want more time. They said during the election, all of the structural reforms are all bad. After the election, that we can live with 70%. So you saw some mellowing there. You also see some mellowing from the Germans. And let us not forget, other countries in Europe had to go through tough measures too. Why is Germany doing so well now? Germany is doing so well now because under Schröder, in the early 2000s, they had the Hartz IV reform, which was a very comprehensive economic reform and social reform. Before that, we thought Germany is the next Japan and they will be in the doldrums for at least 3 decades. And that enabled them to come out from under it. So it's not the first time that a country needs reform, and it will not be the last time.
The Germans are also highly productive. How do rates of productivity differ between Greece and Germany?
Well, you see, that's where I am actually concerned about Greece more than about the whole monetary side. I'm concerned about Greece. I'm concerned about Spain. I'm a little bit less Portugal. I'm concerned about France. The process of desindustrialization, as I call it. These are countries who used to have a manufacturing base. You used to have a more broadly based economy. If you look at Greece and Spain now, it's about tourism and construction. Maybe it's about ships, but it's not about shipbuilding. And, the shipping industry can put itself anywhere. They can go to Singapore. You can put these ships anywhere. Where you have a port, you can put them.
Right.
But when you have only 2 sectors, a service sector and tourism.
It's not a very diversified economy.
It's not a diversified economy, and in order for an economy to do well, and by the way, also in order for an economy to be able to collect taxes, people need to earn money, and in order to earn money, they need to be employed. So the more broadly based you can have your economy, the better it is. So that is where I'm very, very bearish on Greece, where I'm very bearish on Spain, where I'm becoming increasingly bearish on France, because they're just losing their industrial base.
Well, I spent a good part of the weekend with some friends, including a French entrepreneur, and he runs a small but international business. He refuses to hire Frenchmen. He has contractors who are French, but as much as possible, he ships a job overseas because, in his view, once you hire a Frenchman, he's a dependent for life, and he can't afford to do that in a small business.
Absolutely, he's absolutely right. And as you have these systems like with the workers' councils in France, and to a certain extent in Germany, and that's what I was referring to with the economic reforms, the structural reforms in Germany. They sort of gave less rights to the workers, these reforms, and oddly enough, it was a social democratic prime minister, chancellor, Mr. Schröder, who did it. And probably he could do it because he was closer to the union, so he could put it through.
It's the only Nixon could go to China theory about making changes like that.
Exactly.
If you look at the United States, all of the job growth is coming from the right-to-work states. It's
Absolutely.
Texas, it's the South, it's certainly not California, it's not New York.
It is the state, and it is the states, and you have employment at will, which is a very, very useful thing to have. And that's where France is a disaster. Germany is doing better. They have still ways to improve. That's why a small country, Switzerland, is doing quite well. You're not terribly protected as a Swiss worker.
So how do you harmonize labor laws across all of the European Union?
That's something that has to happen. But, surely that huge machinery in Brussels with I don't know how many interpreters, they are able to harmonize standards, and at times they have really silly standards. Really silly standards. Maybe they should concentrate a little bit more on harmonizing the big things, the important things. And my guess is that if you started to do that from Europe, it would be easier for some of the local politicians to do so, because they can say, oh, look, it's not me, but we are in Europe, and it's those big bad guys in Brussels. So certain things that maybe even your social democrat understands need happening, but has a hard time to make happen because he's worried about getting re-elected, he can make happen if there's the big bad ugly guy up in Brussels telling him to do so.
So, Cornelia, you mentioned Syriza mellowing a little bit after getting elected, and yet now they're demanding World War II reparations from the Germans, and they're visiting shrines to people killed by the Nazis. How is this going to work out?
Well, it's just a Greek tragedy that they're trying to reenact here. And I think they have to calm down. And the Germans, and Mr. Schäuble, Mr. Varoufakis, Mr. Schäuble should maybe not be permitted to talk for the next month or so. If you look at it, Greece has more to lose from leaving the euro, I think, than from staying in the euro. You can say, oh yes, everything will be cheaper and more tourists will be coming, but really, because you had this wage deflation, things have become cheaper to travel to Greece. So in that sense, I think they have more to lose, because also Greece is a country that depends for a lot of its necessary things like fuel, food and so on imports. If they leave the euro and go with a very low currency, it will become very difficult for them to basically, stay afloat.
You use the word should a lot. It's very prescriptive in terms of how things could be fixed across Europe. But democracy doesn't always work that way. One of the arguments Syriza makes is bend over to our demands, otherwise they'll throw us out and put the neo-Nazis in, and how would you like that? Is there any chance of that happening in Greece?
I'm not close enough to the Greek political scene, but I would sort of doubt. I mean, you still have some established parties that were kicked out. And at some stage, the Greek public may also get exasperated, may come back from the brink and get exasperated. Why was Syriza so popular? Because a lot of people are very disenchanted with, having lost their jobs. The electorate always wants immediate remedy after they've elected somebody. When they don't see immediate remedy, the established parties at some stage, they have reasonably good machines. They might be getting back in.
At the end of the day, and not to disparage Greece, but their economy is so small that it makes little impact on the rest of the European project. If France stops growing, if France goes into recession, if France can't pay its bills and heads towards sovereign default, what does that do to the European project?
Well, that will be very bad. And France is actually doing the worst of them all. But what I'm worried about in the short term more than France would be Spain and Portugal. They're the other sort of on the brink nations. But France is an important country and, it's the second largest economy in the Eurozone. We need to make sure France prospers. And one of the things that the quantitative easing could potentially give as a gift to these governments is the breathing space for structural reforms. Only I don't see anybody engaging in the structural reforms, either as the labor market reforms, investment reforms, all sorts of reforms they should undertake.
So they should undertake these reforms. They're likely not to. How is quantitative easing, how is buying all these bonds going to help?
It is a short-term fix if they don't. It helps, at this point, quantitative easing helps one country who is against it, and that is Germany. Because if the euro is so low, the German economy is a export-driven economy, and they produce a lot of sort of manufactured goods. And the cheaper they get, the better for them. And especially with China slowing, a lot of the German exports go to China, the machinery needed in the factories of China. With China slowing, they become more discriminative in terms of what they import. So having a lower euro actually helps them. Mr. Schäuble is jumping up and down, and the head of the central bank are jumping up and down in terms of quantitative easing and not liking it. But really, they are the beneficiaries.
So with the euro cratering and countries struggling around the world, doesn't this invite beggar thy neighbor currency wars? And haven't we been through that before in history?
We have been through that before in history, and it's not a good
for
thing.
Everybody.
It's very ugly, and you saw we were last year and the year before, we had a spat of that with the yen going down, and the Koreans really not being able, the Korean manufactured goods not being able to be competing with the Japanese goods. And that did not make for gentle discussions between the two governments.
So things are a little edgy right now in the fiat currency world. Do you ever see gold-backed currencies making a comeback?
I don't think so. I think we are beyond that. I think that's that was the 70s and it's
Well, it
gone.
was for hundreds and thousands of years, not just the 70s.
Yeah, but we gave up in the 70s. I don't see it happen because it's the US is no longer a gold-backed currency. None of the currencies are gold-backed currencies. Going back to it, I'm not sure that that is really on the agenda of any of the central bankers.
So, Cornelia, here we are in London, which has become a great magnet for talent and immigrants all over Europe. Certainly the finance and banking industry continues to grow here. What's the UK view on all of this?
The UK view is quite polarized. You see some parties to the right, like UKIP, the UK Independent Party, who are fiercely anti-immigrant, I would say bordering on racist anti-immigrant. They want to leave the European Union. Then you have the Conservatives who, because they're so scared, because UKIP is eating away at their electoral base, they're very worried and say, we want to have this referendum. So the worst negotiating tactic you can do is you can say, we negotiate about something 10 years from now, or 5 years from now, or 3 years from now, which is what the Conservatives say. We will then see whether we want to stay in or out. And Europe very clearly says, this is not an a la carte menu. You're either in or out. Now, for the UK, it is crucial to be a part of, not of the euro, but of the European Union. Because the tariff structures, you have free movement of goods, free movement of people,
Capital.
and free movement of capital. Now, the free movement of people is what is not agreed upon by everybody, but the free movement of goods and the free movement of capital is crucial for this country. And when you look at a lot of the foreign direct investment that has come into the UK, that has propped up the manufacturing base, car industry, Britain has a fantastic car industry. It's no longer owned by British companies. It's owned by the Japanese companies, the Indian companies. But all these investors only come to Britain because we have access to this big common European market.
Why the exception for the pound?
I think it was psychological as well as economic based. Britain is, after all, a former huge imperial power, and I think the British psyche could not have lived with being with not having its power, with not having the Queen on the banknote. And in hindsight, it was the right thing to do. In hindsight, it was the right thing to do.
So we're seeing quite a lot of gyrations in the energy market. We've now got oil down to maybe $43, $44 a barrel. We haven't seen that kind of number in a long time. Although price in gold, it hasn't changed that much, let me add. What's happening in our energy markets right now?
If we talk globally, that's one thing, then we can talk Europe. Globally, I think OPEC has taken absolutely the right decision in last November when they said they would not change the oil quota. It has made the oil price come down, which has been a huge boost to the economy, to the global economy, according to my model, to the tune to about $1.5 trillion. Because people can now consume more. The budgets are freed up. That's one thing. On the other hand, we had overproduction. We basically have, on your side of the Atlantic, we have these shale oil producers who are highly levered producers, small companies, with a very different profile to big oil. You invest today, you produce 16 months from now. Big oil, you invest today, you produce 10 years from now. So when you look at that, flooding the market with oil means that some of the producers will go out, some of the weakest producers will go out, and people will consume more, which in the end will come to a new equilibrium. So in that sense, we will come to a new equilibrium. It will probably be around 40 or so. That will stay for a little while. We will then, though, fasten your seatbelts. In the next 3 to 5 years, oil prices will go up tremendously because a lot of investment has gone out. I mean, some of the shale producers have put in like 75% less investment. The big oil companies have all gone down the super majors with their investment programs to the tune of about 30%. And that will, get its way into production. And then we will have, yet again, bigger production, maybe better economy in Europe, certainly better economy in emerging markets. So the demand will go up, the supply will not be there, and then oil will go up again.
The current environment for cheap energy does not bode well for alternative energy and people who are pushing windmills and solar. How long can they hang on before they run out of money?
The manufacturers have a hard time, but we will just see further consolidation. We saw a lot of consolidation. The utilities can, depending on the jurisdiction, in some jurisdiction they get so much subsidy that they can go on for a long time.
They can live off the taxpayer dollars forever.
But where I'm more worried with this renewable craze that we are going through, it's a good thing, renewables, and it's really good that we take care of the earth and the climate. However, this is intermittently generated electricity, and we need base loaders. So especially in Europe, in countries like Germany, where you say, "Oh, we don't want nuclear energy anymore.
We don't
want gas. We don't want gas because it comes from Russia, and we don't like Russia at this point." So you're back to coal, and you're not back to clean coal. I would like to see some of the subsidies that are spent on the green technology also spent on clean coal, on carbon capture and storage, because we need that base load capacity to make it all work. So let's make sure that the necessary evil becomes as clean as possible.
Couldn't we also solve the problem by just lowering our standard of living?
But nobody has ever done that. But the really low-hanging fruit is not the standard of living, is energy efficiency. And you see certain economies doing that very well. You saw Japan doing extremely well. They started after the 1973 oil shock, where they were totally dependent on oil. They started really having measures for energy efficiency, and you go into these buildings, they're totally energy efficient. You see in the Gulf with Nasdaq City, you see some attempts of this as well. So there's a lot we can do in terms of consuming less energy and consuming it more responsibly.
So you talk about economic and policy integration. How does this bear on energy?
It is, frankly, nonsensical, because we have a common energy policy that they're devising in Brussels, but the energy mix is left to every country, and you cannot have a common energy policy if some countries have nuclear, other countries don't have nuclear. The energy mix is different per country. It's very hard to then draw up the right structure to incentivize both consumers and producers.
So we're back to central planning only works if you control everything.
Absolutely.
Okay. So Cornelia, we're obviously in for a little more excitement with the euro. We don't know how things are going to work out with Greece. Give us the long-term picture. What does happiness and harmony look like a generation from now?
I think a generation from now, we still have the European project. We can still have free movement of goods and capital and people. And we have a euro that has gone through the phases of infancy. I would sort of liken the euro a little bit to a teenager. Teenagers go through rough patches. We are going through a rough patch now, and certainly, and this may politically not be correct, but sometimes the behavior of the Greek government is a little bit reminiscent of a teenager.
Well, I wish you all the best of luck, and thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
That was international economist and energy expert Cornelia Meyer, chairman and CEO of MRL Corporation, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Please check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by realclearmarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Ahead, Daniel Hannan, Eurosceptic member of the European Parliament, explains why Paul Revere never would have said the British are coming. Stay tuned.